We're going to talk a little bit about the history and the law, because one of the things I'm passionate about is you understanding sort of the philosophy behind this program, why it is the way it is, why it's not sometimes what you think it should be, and how the pieces got folded together, and what we've been doing all these 30 years to make it the amazing success that it is statewide. So we're going to talk about mission and values, performance essentials. You're going to hear from some literacy coordinators on the stage, but you heard there's a whole number of others of you in the audience. You'll hear from more of that. I've got some great resources for you. Hopefully you'll have time to talk to each other and have plenty of time for questions and answers. So that's really what we've got on board for today. And we're going to start with the history and the law. And first I'm going to play for you a little video clip of our former state librarian, Gary Strong. How many of you go as far back as to remember Gary Strong? Well, the whole literacy thing was his idea. And a few years ago, we had the awesome opportunity to have him speak at a PLA conference. And we had this good sense to hire David and his team to videotape him. And so I just want you to hear a part of what Gary has to say about the history right from the horse's mouth.
I was going to say I was pleased to be here, but that line has already been taken. At this stage of my life, I'm pleased to be anywhere. But what pleased me was the opportunity to take a minute to think back to some beginnings, which for me really weren't beginnings, because when I had my first library job, I provided a location in the library, in that very small city library, for a Laubach tutor to meet with her student who she was tutoring to learn to read. And that, learning from Teresa Truchot, who was this spindly little thing of about 87 years old, that reading was one of the most valuable things you could pass on to someone else, was an inspiration that would follow me for a long, long time and to today. Serving as the state librarian of California from 1980 to 1994, I followed the Taxpayers' Revolt, Proposition 13, and found myself challenged to encourage libraries to act in new directions and in new ways. We faced times when budgets were being drastically reduced. Elected officials were hard-pressed, particularly in the counties of California, which is the base library service unit in this state, to meet previous commitments to build and support public libraries. The glory days of California libraries seemed to be over. There were three major initiatives of which I am most proud during my years as state librarian. First and foremost is the California Literacy Campaign and its related Families for Literacy program, the Partnerships for Change initiative, and InfoPeople. Each of these initiatives ask libraries to think outside of their traditional roles in a time of budget disaster, a time when it would have been easy to just give up and close doors. To think outside of those traditional roles and to prepare for a future that would forever be different, because those budgets would never return to the levels that they once were. But we found there was a residual goodwill on the part of the publics that we served and the publics we hoped to serve. And by thinking in new ways, we engaged those publics in new ways. The RAND Corporation study I commissioned in 1987 challenged the very basis of traditional library service in California and forecast a rapidly changing demographic environment which we would need to meet into the future. In 1983, I determined with the support of my consulting staff that we would have to take on a new initiative. Led by then Carmela Ruby, who was an absolute champion in convincing me to get brave, as she put it, we envisioned the California Literacy Campaign, and we purposefully called it a campaign. We set aside $2.5 million of carryover LSCA funding, and applications were invited from public libraries. 26 public libraries were granted funds to start the campaign. I recall one letter in particular from a county librarian who stated that she really didn't think this kind of thing was the thing libraries ought to be doing, but it was new money and she wanted her share, damn it. It didn't take very long. She's now someone, I guess, I wouldn't say who, but I think she's in Washington, D.C. at the moment. It didn't take long for her to become a believer and staunch supporter of what her library experienced. And when she attended her first adult learner program and was introduced to this very striking woman who she thought was the tutor, who just happened to be the wife of the local newspaper individual, owner of the local newspaper, and only to learn along with that gentleman that, in fact, the wife was the student. It changed her life. The campaign focused on native-born adults 16 years and older who spoke English and were below the level of skill that was needed to be enrolled in adult schools across California. There is an enormous backstory. I'm from LA now, so we call them backstories, for this decision and our early difficult road of collaboration with adult education in California. It was not simple to bring the campaign into being because there was so much turf war going on within education and particularly adult education. And I will refer to my battle in New York State in a moment. The then adult ed director in New York State said over his dead body would public libraries ever be educational institutions. This collaboration worked well, however, in California at the state level, with close connections into the Department of Education's adult education program. It was their vision, along with ours, believing that there was absolutely enough turf for all of us that made it work. But it was on the local level where it was to be challenged time and time again. I recall one adult ed conference where I was invited to speak. I approached the podium and the catcalls began from the audience. About a third of the way into my remarks, the boos were raised from the audience when I talked a bit about sharing funding. Before I could finish, several walked out of the conference hall, and I was later escorted out to my car because a group was approaching the podium. It was not a warm, wonderful experience. But those times passed, and our collaborations grew, and as local libraries began to infiltrate and cooperate and partner with community colleges and adult schools, that really turned around significantly. Those of us involved were convinced that public libraries had a significant role to play, even if we had to narrow our scope and what our gut told us we ought to be doing. And the legislature astonishingly agreed. It was a time when there wasn't much bipartisan support for anything in the legislature in California. It was a time when we could not get other funding past the California Library. In a time when we could not get other library funding passed, the California Library Literacy Services Act, as a part of the Special Services Program of the California Library Services Act, was passed to designed to reduce adult illiteracy by providing English language literacy instruction and related services to adults and youth who were not yet enrolled in school. The legislature indeed had confirmed our role and set in state policy the fact that public libraries in California are indeed educational institutions. I am pleased that this legislation was carried jointly by a Republican in the State Assembly, one of the most conservative Republicans in the State Assembly, a later congressman, and the Speaker of the Senate, a Democrat from Los Angeles, one from the Bay Area, one from the North, one from the South. You can imagine the discussions in my hallowed office there in Sacramento as to who we would tap and what we would need to have to make something like this pass in a time when no new programs were being passed in the California legislature. While they would seldom appear together in the Capitol, they made numerous trips to my office together to promote the bill. One such trip, they arrived to have coffee with the First Lady, Barbara Bush, who came to champion our cause. They were impressed, to say the least. This nonpartisan support would be crucial to all of the library issues that we put before the legislature.
So I just wanted you to hear, do you hear some things that sound familiar today related to adult schools, et cetera? I wanted to set the stage so you could hear Gary tell the story. And these are all on the website. I can show you where they are later if you want to see the rest, because it's all very interesting. This leads us into a discussion of the law that created the California Library Literacy Services. We stopped calling it a campaign about 10 years ago when we realized we were 20 years on. And we thought, you know, now we are a service. We are not a campaign. We are not temporary. This is a regular part of what libraries do in California. And so we went back to the California Library Literacy Services name. So if you look in your packet, the green sheet is the law itself. Now, over the years, the name of it got changed. It's now called the California Library Literacy and English Acquisition Service Program. And the reason for that is about, oh gosh, in 2000, I think it was, or 2001, Governor Davis gave us $10 million to do English language literacy instruction for K-12 children. That program is called ELLI, English Language Literacy Intensive. Any of you doing that? Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I'll let you read this at your leisure, but what I wanted to point out to you was a couple of things Gary said, because at the first time I became familiar with the literacy campaign, I thought, why aren't they doing English as a second language, right? Have the rest of you all wondered that? Okay, well, now, here's why. Because you heard what they had to do to get the bill passed through the legislature and supported by the Department of Education. And all the weird things about our program that you think, why is it like that, are all related to what they had to do to get the program passed. So we are not a service for English language learners, not because we don't care or because we don't think it's important, but because the Department of Education sees that as their role. And they literally have millions of dollars that flow through adult schools and community colleges for English as a second language classes. So basically they said, if you're going to do this, you can't step on our territory. Okay, so why do we serve the lowest level adult learner, do you think, based on that conversation? Because the adult schools and the community colleges don't. Okay, so our niche is that very low level learner who can't go to the adult school or the community college because they're not prepared for that. And in many cases, even if they are prepared for it, they can't go there. So that's why we say that our target audience is the very low level adult learner. Why do they have to be 16 and not in school? Because if they're in school, they belong to the Department of Education. Okay? Now, why do you think our family literacy program is for families with children under 5 only? Because if they're in school, they belong to the Department of Education. Okay? So I wanted you to hear Gary talk about shaping this dynamic, amazing piece of legislation that happened after Prop 13. Think about what it took to get this done, that people understood our cause well enough and were willing to work together enough to pull this thing off. But as they went through the process, it was shaped in order to make us a partner with the rest of the adult education community, not seen as competing with the rest of the adult education community. So it's really important for you to have that sort of underpinning of why this is like that. And how many of you are working with your AB 86 consortiums locally? And those of you that don't know that, we'll talk about that in a minute. The same whole process is goes around, comes around, right? The adult education system is trying to reinvent itself, and they're still looking at where do libraries fit. And while some of them have decided, yes, we fit right where we are in our niche, not all of them quite understand that yet. So that's still in progress. We're still working on that. But I want you to have that understanding and that background so that as you plan services and think about where you're going, you understand why our dollars go for certain things and not for others, and why you need to partner in the community to find ways to serve people who are outside of the parameters of our service. So does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Great. And as I said, just put that little green paper under your pillow and you'll absorb the law, and it'll be just fine. So let me just give you a little bit of a history. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary last year, which was pretty awesome. Some of you saw some great stuff we did as a result of that. So in 1984, Gary Strong used some what was then called LSCA money. We now call it LSTA money, right? It's the federal funds for libraries that come to states. He used it to begin 26 libraries starting the program, and it was the following year that the legislature approved the law, and they started funding us. And we've been distributing money to libraries all along. So starting with 24, I'm happy to say that this year, with the addition of our 5 new, we're back up to 102 libraries, which we had dropped a little bit, so that's awesome. We're in all corners of the state, all over the place, but not in every library. We're in probably about 55%, 60% of library jurisdictions in the state. So the legislative intent was this niche for libraries. Where can libraries provide the best service for their communities without stepping on the toes and by partnering with the rest of the adult education environment? So that's where that whole thing came from. 2 years later, there was funding from the legislature for the Families for Literacy program, which we now just call Family Literacy because we don't get separate funding for it anymore. But as I said, it was designed to be a service for adult learners with children under 5 because they are at the most risk of not being ready to go to school. If there are no print materials in your home and nobody's reading to you, you're in a much deeper hole than other children who join you on your first day of kindergarten. So that's a very specific target audience that we work on. And we view it as a service to the family, but specifically it's an additional service you provide to an adult learner. So you've got your adult learners, they come in and tell you what their needs are. If they have children or grandchildren under 5, then you can offer them this additional service of family literacy. And we'll show you a little bit later what that means exactly and how you do it. You used to have to be able to apply to do family literacy because we had separate money for that. We don't have that anymore. So now what we've said is any of you that have an adult literacy program, and you're all required to have one in order to be part of this, you may add the family literacy service if and when you're ready, as long as you follow the program essentials, which we'll look at in just a minute. So I mentioned in early, it was 2000, 2001, Governor Davis gave the Department of Education $50 or $60 million. They gave the state library $10 million to focus on a particular target audience of children, K-12 children, whose language in the home was not English, who had been identified by their teachers as struggling because of their inability to pick up English. So we added a bunch of programs, a whole bunch, 70 maybe or 80. That money lasted for 3 years. We found a way to provide a little bit of money for folks for a while after that, and then many of you know we lost all our money one year, and that went out the window. But we're still happy to say that that a number of you are providing LE services out there, and I'll show you more about that in a minute. And the following year, the Prop 10 Commission, former name of the first 5 commissions, right? They gave us $10 million to buy mobile library literacy vehicles. Who all of you in the room have one? Del Norte has one. You guys, Colusa County has one. There's still about 10 of them out there. And again, this was a one-time grant actually it was a one-time grant to buy them, and then we had 3 years of funding to support them. The idea was that they would be mobile. They would go out and provide, hi, come on in, family literacy services and adult literacy services in places that when people couldn't get to the library or vice versa. So again, though, we had a little bit of money to continue that. When we lost our big funding before, that funding went away. So we still have programs that offer those services, and I'll share them with you so you can see sort of what other libraries are doing. What I want to show you is that all of these things work together. So if we start with this history and this sort of basis for where the program came from, then I'll show you that everything else flows from that. And I'll tell you, and I said this to the state librarian the other day, that whenever you have to make a decision about where to go with this program, you go to the law, you go to the mission and values. And that's how we make the decisions. And I'll say the same thing to all of you. When you've got a decision to make about where to go next or what to cut back on, take a look at the law, take a look at the mission and values, because that'll tell you. It'll help you make those decisions. A couple things I wanted to make sure I said about the law that I didn't. It says in the law that not only that we are English-speaking adult learners, but that this program is volunteer-based. Okay? It was always envisioned as a volunteer-based program. It asks you to either join or form a local literacy coalition. That's in the law. If you have questions about that, we can talk about your individual situations, but most of you, I think, are in pretty good shape. If you want to talk about that more, we can. It also says that we are a state and local partnership, and I hope that you'll see that throughout what we try to do. We see that we're not successful if you're not successful. That's definitely the way we look at it. And finally, one of the requirements for family literacy is that you provide books for ownership to the families so that we are increasing the print materials in the home.